Welcome, everyone. We're going to take a few minutes to let everybody join in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, welcome to our broadcast today, Worker Safety, Cannabis, and Hazardous Industries. This is our quick hit series, Green Spoon Martyr's quick hit series. Going to be a little more than a quick hit today. We might take a few hits. I am Nick Richards. I'm a partner and chair of the cannabis practice here at Green Spoon Martyr. I am really excited today to have Carol Sigmund joining me. Carol is my partner in New York. She and I have been having a lot of fun together, and we're having a good time working together. So I'm really excited for this day today. Carol, thank you so much for joining us on this. I'm going to toot your horn a little bit, if that's okay. I went on and looked at your bio, and you're even more impressive than I thought. Look, Carol is a construction, real estate, and litigation lawyer. I think construction is the main focus of her practice, but she is such an amazing, smart lawyer that she does a number of different other things as well. She's been doing this for 40 years, folks. She is a real authority in the space. Was vice president of the New York Bar Association at one point. I think was president of the New York City Bar Association at one point. Is a real who's who in the world of legal. I got every kind of accolade you could think of. Who's who, top rated, must call, all that good stuff. And so Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. Anything I missed there? Any accolade you want to point out?
Only that I was president of New York County Lawyers, not the city bar.
Okay, yes. Any like, have you authored any cookbooks or any self-help videos or anything like that?
Books.
Okay, so today we are going to be talking about hazardous industries and cannabis use in states where it's legal, we got a few different topics that we're going to cover today, and Carol's going to talk about each of these ones that you see on your screen now. We are specifically talking about the problems with use of any substance, really, but here we're going to be talking about cannabis in hazardous industries. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those industries are, what kind of activities are hazardous. We're going to talk about some of the employer options. This is a real concern for employers, obviously, and particularly those who employ individuals in the hazardous industries, construction, et cetera. We'll talk about worker safety and the necessary steps to ensure worker safety. We'll talk a little bit about the Canadian and European experience in this. This is in a developing area, so we're looking to some other sources to find, to get some ideas about how to work through this. We'll talk about drug testing, and we've got some good news on that front. And that is that game changer that we'll talk about. And then we'll talk about some considerations, and this game changer is going to take a little while. So we'll talk about some considerations in the meantime until we can get a good test in place to test for impairment in the workplace. So really excited about that. If I could get the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about what those hazardous work activities are. Carol, am I a hazardous worker?
Probably not, Nick.
Only on this program, I think.
Yeah, probably on the program, but not generally. Look, if you want to look for some defining principles in hazardous work, it generally entails people working with their hands. You got to be doing something manual. Your reaction time needs to matter. Your reflexes need to matter, and your ability to fix your body in space needs to matter. So think about a roofer, for example. If he's working toward the edge of the roof, he's got to put on a safety jacket, and he's got to clip himself to the safety equipment. Okay, that means he needs to get the equipment on, but he also needs to be able to make sure he actually secures the clip.
Yes.
And if he's not good on his depth perception, if he's not real sharp and he doesn't get himself clipped, he could be in trouble.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Could trip. He could not see what he needs to see and he could trip.
Yeah.
So that's the key, but it's not just construction. It's trucking, it's chauffeuring, it's delivery truck drivers, it's logging, which is one of the most dangerous activities in the country. But it also applies to pilots, oil field workers, sanitation workers, farm workers, power workers. It can apply to a surgeon. And I like to think about the Postal Service. The guy, the mail carrier who carries a bag with mail or pushes one of those three-wheel carts, he's probably not engaged in hazardous work. But what about the driver of the postal truck? Yeah. Or even more importantly, the guy operating the sorting machine.
Yeah.
So that's the way to think about it. If these three factors matter, then it could be hazardous work. And we're talking about cannabis today, but this can apply to alcohol, antihistamines. You know, they can affect people. There are
prescription drugs, I would imagine. Yeah.
Affect people, and you know, you'll sometimes get a warning. You know, don't operate machinery on this drug until you know how it affects you. So but cannabis, because it's currently a Schedule I drug, and because its legalization is sort of in the amorphous stage, is a special case right now. But in fact, what I'm hoping is that by the end of this webinar, we're talking about cannabis as just one more on the spectrum that we have to deal with.
Yeah. And it's not really our topic today, but for those of you out there that are engaged in these kind of industries or owners of these kind of businesses, you know, Green Spoon Martyr is uniquely positioned to help you manage this risk and look at your various employment documents and best procedures to make sure that you are ahead of the curve on this and not setting yourself up for a problem. We do that for a lot of companies, and we would love to help you out on that. Okay, let's go on to our next slide then. And Carol, so employers have some options. You know, it's interesting, Carol. I was thinking earlier about our discussion, and I thought to myself, you know, it used to be easy. If you had it on you, if you were in possession of it, that was all somebody needed, right? But now possession is legal, right? You can be carrying marijuana on your person. If you are, you might smell like marijuana, but you might not have consumed marijuana at all. And so it's really a different environment now, isn't it?
Yes, it's different for two reasons. First of all, you have a number of states, the majority of them now, that have legalized it in some fashion or another. And you have the policies from the Justice Department where they are not prosecuting, you know, mere possession of cannabis. They've kind of recognized that it's not a gateway drug. If you digress for 30 seconds and go back to the Wickersham report from the Hoover administration, which was a very detailed report on crime in America that really documented the rise of criminal gangs and organized crime in the United States based on prohibition. That commission got one thing very wrong, and that was they listed cannabis as a gateway drug to more serious drug use. That probably was their greatest mistake. I've read much of the Wickersham report, and it is the only real criticism I have based on developments over the 80 years since. They got that wrong. It's not a gateway.
It's amazing how long we've been getting it wrong, Carol, and hopefully we can start getting it right.
Yeah. But cannabis is still technically a controlled substance on Schedule I. As a result, if you are an employer in the hazardous work area, you employ construction workers, you employ drivers, you employ people who work in meat packing on a manufacturing line, you're probably going to be able to terminate them for any connection with cannabis. They test positive, they have it on their person, you catch them smoking. Even if it's legal in that state, your termination of that employee is probably going to be upheld. You have the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which makes The federal law is superior to the state law, but more importantly, you have OSHA, which has usurped the worker safety area, which is going to treat cannabis as a Schedule I drug because OSHA is a federal agency, and you win. You win. But go back to my example of the Postal Service. And if the person you're firing is the driver or the sorting machine operator, yeah, you are going to win. If it's the guy pushing the cart who's not engaged in anything hazardous, I don't like your chances. You may well lose if you fire them merely for testing positive. But, you know, the workers on the construction site, the people driving, surgeons, you know, dentists, anyone who's working with their hands, they're at risk if they test positive or have it on them. And the employers have pretty much complete control right now.
Carol, is there some state law sort of variations on that? I know that we did have a case here in Colorado where an employer fired an employee for consuming cannabis on their own time after work. And that was upheld. And I believe that was because of our employee laws. And then I also know that there are some, here in Colorado, it's a constitutional amendment that allows use and possession of cannabis. And so is there a state constitutional right issue that can come up in this as well?
Sure. Anything is possible. You can construct any fact pattern that you want. But the basic problem is if you are in what we're thinking of as hazardous work, that is to say you're a manual worker, you have to have good reaction time. You have to know where your body is in space. You can hurt yourself or kill someone else if you make a serious enough mistake, like you don't clip your safety vest or something of that nature. I think that OSHA is going to allow you to, the OSHA regulations and the employer obligations and the general duty clause of OSHA are going to give the employer tremendous latitude, even with the constitutions. There are state law differences on what is on the edges of hazardous work. There are some state law differences on what might be considered hazardous. Some might consider any work in a hospital hazardous. Others might just limit it to the people who actually deal with patients and scalpels. Others might have a different standard, people who deal with patients and maybe needles. You have a number of different ways you can look at this from state to state, but the basic rule, I think, that the general duty clause is going to protect an employer in the hazardous work area right now, I think that's probably pretty solid.
Yeah. Thank you. That's something I've wondered about with our continuing evolving legalization. Great. So it's clear that an employer in a hazardous workspace has the right to fire, and that right appears fairly broad, not just limited to testing positive. Could be beyond that, having it on your possession, any risk that might show up. And Carol, I would imagine that that's a big deal for an employer's insurance policy as well, would be my guess.
Enormous. I mean, I think that until we can deal with this issue in a way that workers' compensation and general liability carriers can really have some certainty that they've got some controls over this issue, it's going to be very difficult for national legalization. Yeah. I can't see the insurance industry being enthusiastic about legalization if there isn't a reliable way to determine who's impaired, and there isn't a reliable way to get them off of a hazardous job or out of a hazardous site. But I want to point something out. We currently have a shortage of drivers. Okay, we have 70,000 people who are currently on a list maintained by the federal government who can't get interstate commerce licenses for certain trucking activities because they've got some connection with marijuana. It could be medical marijuana. So we can do some things on the employment level to ease some of our trucking issues if we can get a reliable way to determine who's under the influence and who's not, so that we can begin to have a more realistic segregation of the danger from, the non-danger, if you will. But the insurance industry, I have to think that from their perspective, this is an enormous risk.
That list, Carol, reminds me that there's been a lot of folks that have been really hurt by the war on drugs. And I just want to say that, Green Spoon Martyr is one of the firms leading the charge in working to remedy those situations and bring those folks back into a meaningful relationship with their governments and get them out from under that cloud. And so we are very proud of that work that we do. Let's go to the next slide.
I was going to say, I'm looking at what can be done from a pro bono point of view to try to attack that list of 70,000 people too.
Yeah. And for those of you on this call, we are looking for partners in that efforts. And we welcome comments and assistance in dealing with that very difficult reality. Okay, let's talk worker safety. What do we got going on here, Carol?
Well, first of all, because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, we don't do enough real research in this country. And one of the things that we need to do is have Congress authorize, meaningful US-based research, because we have small studies. We do peer review of the Europeans and the Canadians, but we really haven't done enough research ourselves. That said, the current data available, be it from the United States or Canada or Europe, is that cannabis does affect judgment, concentration, fine motor, decision-making, memory, learning, and attention. And these are the underlying skills for reaction time and where is your body in space. Those kinds of issues that we talked about before. These are all the same body of skills. So all of this concerns the guy clipping his vest for roof protection. So, and there have been studies. The National Institute of Drug Abuse looked at cannabis use and associated it with higher accident rates, more injuries, and more absenteeism. Maybe higher accident rates, yes, more injuries, maybe. The absenteeism is a little misleading. This study did not control for cannabis use based on medical condition. So if someone was using cannabis to control pain for cancer or something like that, they would have been treated as an absenteeism case, even if the underlying cause for their absenteeism was cancer. So this study is one that should really be redone with fresh research and better controls.
And that's a little bit true of a lot of the studies out there, isn't it? They've all got a little bit of a, hey, wait a minute.
All of them should be, all of them have to.
And Carol and I have been having some fun discussing, there's been some studies out there that show that cannabis improves your performance. And so, I like to bring that up. I think that's just a little bit of, fun back and forth. I think it's probably clear that, any drug use on the job in a hazardous situation is problematic. And it's likely that, that it, even if it does enhance certain aspects, it probably is detrimental to others and things like that. And so I'm not sure that that's a useful conversation, but it is kind of fun. And I think about caffeine, right? Caffeine is a performance enhancer. And gosh, Carol, there are over 100 cannabinoids in marijuana, various forms of marijuana. And we really don't know what, we talk about 2 or 3 of them. There's a lot to go. And there's a lot to learn about the plant and And that learning process and the knowledge that we'll get from that can only help us.
Yes, I actually do want to make one very important point. In the hazardous work area, the most serious issue is not cannabis, it's alcohol.
Yeah.
And there is a 2018 study that's referenced in the slide that workplace fatalities among younger workers went down in legalization areas, possibly due to less alcohol consumption. So let us not ever forget that alcohol is a major problem in the hazardous work area. And we haven't solved that problem since Prohibition.
Right, right.
So, and insurers are not happy with it. And, you know, here in New York, an alcoholism on the part of the worker being impaired doesn't impact their ability to get workers' compensation or other compensation for workplace injuries. There's a real question as to whether or not that's a sound public policy. It's not a consistent policy nationally. But this discussion will have to go on in the cannabis area too, about whether cannabis, use of cannabis on the job is a forfeiter on certain kinds of benefits. But that's an issue to be debated.
Will there be a level that is acceptable like there is with alcohol? Is that a place we'll get to, or what do you think about that?
I think that's very possible.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly because there are, as you point out, so many compounds in marijuana, some of which do not have any mind-altering impacts. They may just reduce someone's pain. They may just, have some other impact. Maybe it lowers blood pressure, who knows? And doesn't have any mind-altering effect, or the mind-altering effect is minimal. But there is now, I think, some hope that we may be able to get in that direction. At least someone has, as we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, has an idea.
Great, thank you for that, Carol. I think that's a very interesting discussion, and I think there's a lot to do there, and there's a lot of opportunity for people there too in discovering all these new properties from the plant. So really exciting stuff there. Okay, so let's go on to our next slide. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on north of us and across the great ocean. It's not ocean, it's OSHA, right? I got a little mixed up there earlier. Tell us what's going on. What are those Canucks up to?
The Canadians have studies that suggest that there's no connection between cannabis use outside the workplace and elevated accident rates. And the Europeans have the same research. They've had the same findings. And my guess is that if we were to allow that type of research in the United States, we would find the same thing. Mm-hmm.
Carol, that's really important, right? Because it stays in our system for a little while, doesn't it?
Yes. The cannabis is stored in the fat cells. It's released at different times by different people in different rates. So someone who's thinner or heavier or has a faster or slower metabolism is going to release it or hold it for different amounts of time. But you can use cannabis on Saturday night and still test positive on Wednesday.
Yeah.
And be under the influence at all. And that's been the big conundrum.
And so those studies show that in that situation where it's still in your system in some way and you're still testing positive, in fact, there is no impairment so long as you haven't recently consumed it, I guess.
That is what the Canadians and Europeans are saying. The US hasn't really done enough research. That's one of the real concerns in this area, is that we have to get Congress to lift the prohibitions on this particular drug to allow meaningful, government-funded, widespread research that the big pharma can participate in, the big universities can participate in, that can really be done. I mean, we can't leave this as a risk factor and the research studies be too small. We have to open this door very wide.
And that'll really benefit the hazardous industries that we're talking about.
Right. It would really, and the insurance industry.
Yeah.
But yeah, that sitting behind this is their insurers. And we need to be very realistic about this. We cannot put this kind of a burden on that industry and expect it to perform well.
You know, and of course, on the flip side of that, Carol, there are a lot of insurance companies that are lining up to give insurance to cannabis companies. They want to sell insurance to the cannabis companies, and of course, that insurance is quite expensive. And so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword for them, I guess.
Yeah, that's fine, but I'm talking about the insurance that they want to sell to construction companies and
right.
companies and taxi companies. All of these people have to buy insurance too. And right now, the industry really needs to be assured that it's not taking on a mammoth risk of increased motor vehicle collisions or, worker injuries. We really need to deal with this issue, and that really requires research.
Well, and of course, there are hazardous activities within the cannabis industry itself. There is the processing aspect, creating the cannabis oil, that can be hazardous. There are various machines that cannabis companies use for harvesting and trimming the marijuana and all that kind of stuff. So it really cuts across almost all industries, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, cannabis, as far as I'm concerned, is basically, at least the cannabis grow, is farming.
Yeah.
The cannabis processing is just like any other food processing, meat packing or any other food processing. It has inherent dangers.
Great, thank you so much. So we know that there's been these studies that show that this sort of after effect, the sort of latent marijuana in our systems do not impair us, and studies that show that active consumption of marijuana does impair us. And we know that testing is a problem as well. Let's see what else we're talking about. Can I get the next slide, please? And shall I say that most importantly, we know that, as Carol said, that employers have the right and power to make sure that their workplaces are safe. And that is a right that we don't think will go away, and we want to help make sure that employers exercise that right properly and with proper guidance. And so thank you for that, Carol. That's those very important information. Let's talk about positive tests for cannabis in the workplace. Can't I just go drink a whole bunch of cranberry juice, Carol?
I don't think so. I don't think that affects the THC that's stored in the fatty tissue that gets picked up in the blood tests.
Interesting. What are positive tests looking like here? Are they reliable?
They're reliable in the sense that yes, someone has used marijuana. They're totally unreliable as to when. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they're useless as to impairment.
And hey, look, Carol, we just got a question that feeds right into this now about what it's reliable for and what it's not reliable for. Michael Minardi says, hey, what about the possibility of companies being able to differentiate between hemp use versus marijuana use when they're testing? Is that also a problem?
I don't think there's a reliable test for that yet either.
And let me say this. So hemp has, 3% or under of THC in it. So consumption of hemp can get you some THC too. And I would think that in that case, then you could test positive for THC, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally when you think about hemp, in consuming it anyway, you think about CBD. as the cannabinoid that we're trying to get in our hemp products because of all the beneficial aspects that CBD allegedly causes. And so there's a lot of people out there consuming hemp. Should they be concerned with these tests, Carol?
They could test positive for THC. So yes, yeah, possibility.
Michael, thank you for your question. What else? What about the National Institute of Occupational Safety? What do they think?
They are looking at impairment testing. They're looking for an impairment test to evaluate a worker's real-time motor skills and function. These are
one of those ones where you stand on the side of the road on one foot and you pat your head and rub your nose or whatever.
Yeah, they're about accurate about half the time. They're not really, at this point, a useful test.
Carol, half the time, is that any better than guessing?
Not in my head. Yeah, objective.
Yeah.
It's too open to subjectivity. I mean, given the history that we have with certain groups being more heavily policed than other groups, I can imagine that, shockingly enough, if left to their own devices, somehow people of color will always be thought to be impaired more than people who are not of color. So
yeah, Carol, you know, I can't hear that from you and not say, look, the war on drugs has you know, affected people of color much more than, you know, us white guys out there. And it's been a real tragedy for communities of color. And that is another area that those of us in the cannabis industry are really trying to address and help those folks out and get past that really, really sad part of our history. And move forward. And a number of states are recognizing that, including the federal government in its most recent proposed legislation, that people who were harmed in the war on drugs need to get a little benefit out of cannabis legalization. And that's a challenging road. And it poses a number of different problems along the way. We at Green Spoon Water are helping social equity candidates, giving them free legal time and helping them get along their way so that they can get in the industry and be successful. And we're very, very proud of that. Yes, and Carol is one of our real leaders in that charge. So thank you, Carol, for that.
Yeah, and not only through Green Spoon Water, but also through the organized bar, we're making efforts. And we're looking, as I say, for additional partners in this, because the more people that contribute to this effort, the better. This has to change, and it has to get done. We cannot continue to operate with two justice systems, one for people who are white and one for people who are of color. It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is, and it's a real sad situation. And thank you for that, Carol. Let's go on to the next slide. I think we covered this one. Let's see what we got next coming up. Oh, here it is, Carol. Game changer. Put on your white coat.
So last week, on Thursday of last week, January 13, Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital released a peer-reviewed article. And I think we'll be sending a link to everyone who's registered so you can get the article easily. Showing that the brains of people under the influence of THC show an area of the brain in the prefrontal cortex that has activity for those who are currently under the influence of THC. This particular test was administered using a simple handheld scanner and was 76% accurate. That was roughly twice as accurate as the so-called field sobriety test that we talked about before. The area of greatest inaccuracy was false negatives for those who were heavy users of THC. The authors of the study recommend obviously more investigation of this methodology. They also think that more refinement of the device and maybe some additional testing. They only used about 169 subjects, but a bigger test sample, done over longer time, more broadly, would give them more accurate information for the heavier users. And I'm thinking that there could be some simple engineering done to give settings so that if you're administering the test to someone that you know is a heavy user, you would administer the test with a slightly higher, level of intensity or, different readings. But these look to me to be more in the nature of engineering type issues, that the technology is simple. It's already basically in use. It's not dissimilar to MRI technology, but we're literally talking about a handheld device. So this is less invasive than a breathalyzer, less invasive than a blood test. And in the case of cannabis, accurate. It's got a fairly high level of accuracy in this test study, with a fairly consistent area of inaccuracy, which means that can be addressed by further refinements. So the game has now changed. Yeah. We are no longer, I think, looking at bodily fluids. I think the whole concept of drug testing by urine or blood is gone, dead, finished. This is going to be the game. And this makes it actually possible to determine current impairment.
Now, Carol, I got to challenge you on that. Are you telling me that increased brain activity equals impairment?
No, this is a particular chemical of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. And the type of impairment, keep in mind, is the one we're talking about. Hand-eye coordination, where is your body in space, and reflex time.
So the test itself doesn't show impairment. I guess if we conclude that marijuana use equals impairment, then the test that shows that there is marijuana use gets us there.
Well, THC, remember, this is looking specifically at THC, not CBD.
Got it.
Look, it's looking at THC because THC is the drug that seems to be the one that has the effect on reaction times and judgment and where is your body in space and hand-eye coordination. But if that premise that THC has that negative impact on those activities is correct, and we can determine from this scan the immediate presence of THC in the person's system, then we have some evidence of the person being under the influence of THC. The question that then comes up is the one you asked before, which is, what's the degree? Mm-hmm. Can this test be refined to the point where it determines that, yeah, you might have smoked a joint, but it's not actually impairing you. Yeah, you got some evidence of it, but it's not actually an impairment. That's going to require a lot more testing and a lot more study. But the mere fact that we would be able to determine who was currently under the influence is just a huge game changer.
Yeah.
Because anybody who's using it recreationally and using it for medical reasons and just using it on the weekends and not using it, while they're on the job, they've just been eliminated from an area of concern.
And I know that when we were talking about this yesterday on our group call, one of our group members said, hey, there could be some biometric data issues in conducting these tests. I thought that was interesting. Carol, that's way out of my wheelhouse. But I think there's some things we got to get through to be able to actually do this, is what I'm thinking. And there could be some legal issues around it as well. Is that where you're at on it?
Yep. I think that the biometric issue was interesting. Biometrics generally entails the ability to identify people. This one probably would have biometric data because you have to have the person's name and some kind of identifying information. And if you were storing results for any reason, then you could be hitting up against that issue. My sense is that if there is a move to national legalization, and this is the technique that is ultimately perfected to determine current impairment, that this is going to be part of the federal law, and it's going to trump these state statutes. And I think that with OSHA's involvement in the hazardous work area and its heavy influence, and it's having trumped everyone else already, if OSHA sets the standards, that's going to become a national standard. I don't see this being picked apart at the state level. Maybe some data storage issues or things like that. There may be some privacy questions that have to be adjusted state by state. But my sense is that if the insurance industry decides that this is what they're going to get behind, they're going to insist on a federal solution, and they're going to insist on federal standards, and they're going to insist on usurping this away from the state governments and the state laws so that there's national consistency. And if you
and I would think that, go ahead.
If you think about trucking, if you think about dock workers, if you think about the railroad workers, if you think about pilots, you have to have a national standard. They're going to too many states. It would be too complicated for the employers. It just would.
Yeah, I would say that's the federal government probably has the constitutional right to do that under their dormant commerce clause. And if there's any doubt of that, I think we could look to the really one of the first cases out there in this area, Gonzalez v. Raich, which upheld federal listing as a Schedule I controlled substance after California legalized it for medical use. So it would seem to me that the state would definitely have that power as well. So that's very interesting. And Carol, I think the industry would welcome that as well. The industry is amazingly responsible in the way in which it wants to conduct its business activities. It's one of the most regulated industries in the entire country, and it wants to see responsible use of cannabis as well.
I think that this is a win-win for everybody. I think it's a win-win for the hazardous work industries. I think it's a win for governments in the tax revenue area. I think it's a win for the industry.
Yeah. Because,
they're not looking at what I would think of as the sort of the gun solution. All of these efforts for private rights of actions against the gun companies for, turning loose these guns on the street. I can definitely see that this helps everybody.
Yep.
But most importantly, it keeps people safe. And that's what we're really talking about, is not having people lose a hand, or not having people die, and not having them fall off the roof of a construction site. And that's what we're really concerned about here, is people's lives and safety and well-being.
You bet.
If you have priority in mind, this becomes very simple. Everybody wins. But most importantly, I think the insurance industry wins, because they get what they need, which is the ability to know and measure the risk.
Carol, do you think this breakthrough might be helpful in getting legislation passed? Could this be one of the things that's been holding us back? And maybe
it seems to me there would have to be, because the insurance industry is so huge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's massive if you think about it. Just massive.
Yeah.
And it's international industry, and we think of it as large in the United States. It's even larger in Europe. The European insurance companies dwarf the American insurance companies, and the American insurance companies are massive.
That's just because Sotheby's will insure anybody. I saw on TV about various movie stars whose legs are insured. I guess J-Lo, J-Lo's right leg is carrying a higher insurance policy than her left leg, because she has a scar on her left leg. So it's only worth $1 million, whereas her right leg is worth 1.5.
Yeah, but I can't begin to tell you. Think about it. AIG, the collapse of AIG nearly took down the U.S. economy.
Really good point.
And look at what the Biden administration did in the CARES Act. They put $50 billion in the CARES Act to help bail out union pension funds. Why? Because there were half a dozen insurance companies that were looking at total wipeout if these union plans began to fail. I mean, the insurance industry is huge and unfortunately can't be allowed to fail. It's just too big, too important. And it's part of the fabric of our society in terms of spreading the risk of loss.
Yeah.
I mean, it serves a real public interest here. I mean, I'm not trying to, boost the stock prices of the insurance companies. I'm just being realistic. They are part of the fabric of spreading the risk. So I can't see how this happens, how legalization happens without dealing with their issues, and their important issues.
Carol, I also remember that in the various shutdowns that we've all gone through recently here, the states where cannabis was legal declared the cannabis industry to be essential workers in an essential industry. And so, so we all have to figure out the right answer to this. It's all important. And I think we're making some progress. I'm excited that we've got this new study and that we're maybe going to start seeing some real science around this stuff and get to a place where we can all move forward.
I think this is just so big, and I don't even think that we really thought through the full implications of what Harvard and Mass Gen have come up with here. Yeah, it's not a practical solution today, but it certainly suggests there is a practical solution to come. And not so far in the distant future, because a lot of the technology being used is already, FDA approved. It's already out there. It's established science and engineering. I see this as more an engineering problem than anything else.
Great.
Engineering solved.
I think we got our last slide coming up here. Maybe Carol, we've already been talking through this quite a bit. Anything you want to add here on this slide?
I think the only point we really didn't consider when we prepared this slide was the broad nature of who's going to really benefit from this. It isn't just hazardous work, it's law enforcement, it's public safety. And if it's kept, the technology remains as simple as it is now, it's going to be simple to administer. It's going to be fair. It's going to be possible to look at this objectively and not have, one set of rules if you happen to be a member of one racial group and another set of rules if you happen to be a member of a different racial group. It's going to be, it's going to be science, and it's going to be chemistry, and it's going to be engineering, and that's going to be it. So, but it can simplify the life of the police, emergency room workers. They can quickly determine if someone who's been brought in after an accident is on cannabis, and whatever adjustments they have to make in the treatment, they can make immediately. There are a myriad of impacts that we haven't even really thought about. No, this is very big. And
we're just getting started.
We're just getting started.
Carol, I think that was our, do we have a conclusion slide here? Interim considerations. Where are we going, Carol? What do we need to know while we wait for these Harvard folks to, privatize this product and start making money off of it?
For the moment, I think employers should keep their prohibitions on cannabis use at work in the hazardous area in place, because they'll continue to be upheld until this test or something like it is there. The proof of use in the workplace until the impairment testing is more advanced is going to be the key. And now we see that could be 2 years away, 3 years away. And this could be, really on the horizon. You never get too far in this business away from alcohol, because it is, I think, more dangerous than cannabis, causes more injuries and more death than cannabis. Maybe some of what's developed in the cannabis area will help in the alcohol area. That's got to continue to be a focus, because it continues to be a cause of loss of life and limb. And I want to make the point that, we've been dealing with the alcohol issue for 100 years, and we haven't really satisfactorily solved it. And we're looking at pushing through a solution to cannabis in a blink of an eye compared to what's gone on with the alcohol.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's really important. And Carol, I want to say one more thing about, if you're an employer and you run up against a worker that you believe is impaired, Carol, that's a moment where the employer needs to make that record, right? And that is one of those HR moments where what that employer does from that point on is extremely important. Would you agree with that?
And many of the union contracts allow for certain kinds of required medical tests. Many state laws will allow for employers to require certain kinds of medical examinations to be eligible for work in the hazardous area. Employers need to understand their state law limitations in this area. They need to look at, the particular nature of the work to see what they can and can't do. But, and you may need, unfortunately, to consult one of us for something like that. But this is definitely an area where employers need to be alert and need to get the right resources in place when they need them.
Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate what you've had to say to us today. Let's see that last slide if we've got one. Yes, we had a couple questions, and we've got one more here, Carol, that I'll read to you. Can employers that have both drivers as well as desk workers or a similar mix treat employees differently as far as testing and standards go? Carol, we're getting kind of into an employment area, and we got a ton of really good employment lawyers here at the firm. You and I are not those lawyers, but we are lawyers. What do you think about that? Can we treat different workers differently?
By classification, yes. If you can definitely say to those people who are employed in what we've been talking about as the hazardous area, that there's one set of standards, and those who are in non-hazardous jobs, there's a different set of standards. It's rational, it's work related, it's business related, it's insurance related. Fact of the matter is, your carrier probably requires it, if you read the fine print of your policy right now, that you have those differential policies in place. And if there's a question under your state law, give us a call. We cover the nation.
Thank you, Carol. This has been really great. Did you have any, I kind of cut you off there. I was going to toot your horn one more time before we go, but it sounded like you had one more thing to say.
No, I was done. I'm sorry.
Carol, do you have a recommendation for the best bagel shop there in Manhattan?
Leo's.
Leo's?
Leo's.
All right, guys, you got it straight from Carol Sigmund, my partner in New York. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us today. Really fun to talk to you about this stuff. And look, we'll want to hear some more about this as this develops. So we will look back to you and really, 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 really appreciate your excellent insight today. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Nick.